Before Europe woke up, the world already had a capital. While medieval Europe was fragmented, poor, and inward-looking, there was a city so vast, so wealthy, and so advanced that travelers believed it stood at the center of civilization. Its name was Chang'an, a city of more than 1 million people, the largest city on Earth, a place where Persian merchants prayed beside Buddhist monks, where Arab traders negotiated silk, spices, and silver, where Korean envoys, Japanese scholars, Indian monks, and Central Asian generals walked the same streets, under the same laws. This was not Rome, this was not Byzantium, this was Tang China, an empire that ruled not just with armies, but with systems. An empire that controlled global trade without oceans, that projected power across half of Asia without permanent borders, that governed more cultures, languages, and religions than any empire before it. For over a century, China was not part of the world. China was the world. And yet, one rebellion nearly erased it all. This is the story of how the Tang Dynasty rose from chaos, became the beating heart of the medieval world, and why its shadow still shapes Asia today. Every great empire is born from disorder. The Tang Dynasty did not rise in a time of peace, but from the collapse of a dream. In the late 6th century, China was ruled by the Sui dynasty, a regime that attempted to reunify a fractured land after centuries of civil war. At first, the Sui succeeded. They rebuilt roads, they restored canals, they reunited North and South China under one crown. But ambition turned into obsession. The Sui emperors launched massive construction projects, endless military campaigns. They forced millions of peasants into labor. Taxes soared, famines spread. Rebellions erupted across the countryside. By the early 600s, China was exhausted. Bandits roamed the roads. Warlords carved out their own territories. The empire was unified on paper, but shattered in reality. This was the world into which the Tang Dynasty was born. In the north, near the frontier, lived a general named Li Yuan. He was not a revolutionary. He was not dreaming of empire. He was a cautious man, a veteran officer, a survivor. But when the Sui government began to collapse, Li Yuan understood something crucial. If he did nothing, China would fall into total anarchy. In 617 CE, with the support of frontier troops and powerful aristocratic families, Li Yuan marched on the capital. The Sui emperor was removed. A child was placed on the throne. And soon after, Li Yuan took the crown for himself. In 618 CE, he proclaimed a new dynasty, the Tang Dynasty. Li Yuan became Emperor Gaozu, but the empire he inherited was fragile. Rival warlords still controlled vast regions. Rebellions flared constantly. And beyond China's borders, powerful enemies watched closely. The Tang state existed, but it was not yet secure. The true architect of the Tang Empire was not its founder. It was his son, Li Shimin. From a young age, Li Shimin proved himself a brilliant commander. He crushed rival warlords, defeated rebel armies, and secured Tang control over northern China. But success bred danger. Inside the imperial court, rivalry grew between princes, and Li Shimin's greatest threat did not come from rebels, but from his own brothers. In 626 CE, the Tang Empire stood on the edge of civil war. Li Shimin made a decision that would define Chinese history. At dawn, near the northern gate of the capital, he ambushed his rivals. The event would become known as the Xuanwu Gate Incident. His brothers were killed. Power was seized through blood. It was ruthless, it was brutal, and it saved the empire. Shortly afterward, Li Yuan abdicated. Li Shimin ascended the throne. He would be remembered as Emperor Taizong. Taizong understood something few rulers ever grasp. An empire is not held together by fear alone. It is held together by competence. He reformed the government, expanded merit-based examinations, and surrounded himself with officials who were not only allowed, but encouraged to criticize him. He famously said, "A ruler is like a boat. The people are like water. Water can carry the boat, or overturn it." Under Taizong, the Tang state stabilized. Taxes were rationalized, law codes standardized, corruption punished, and once the heart of the empire was secure, Taizong looked outward, because beyond China's borders, a storm was waiting. China was unified once again, but unity was only the beginning. To the north and to the west, nomadic empires dominated the steppe. They had destroyed dynasties before, and they would try again. If the Tang were to survive, they would have to become something no Chinese empire had ever been, a continental military superpower. When the Tang Dynasty secured its throne, the real test began beyond China's borders, because to the north and to the west, the world was ruled not by cities, not by laws, but by horses. For centuries, Chinese dynasties had lived in fear of the steppe. Nomadic empires rose and fell like storms, appearing suddenly, striking deep, then vanishing beyond the horizon. They were fast, they were mobile, they were deadly. The most powerful among them were the Gök Turks, a confederation of Turkic tribes that controlled the vast corridor, from Mongolia to Central Asia. They dominated the trade routes. They raided Chinese frontiers. They decided who could move safely across Eurasia. Previous Chinese dynasties had tried to contain them, with walls. The Tang chose a different strategy. They would beat the steppe at its own game. Emperor Taizong understood a brutal truth. Defensive wars against nomads always fail. So instead of waiting, he attacked. Tang armies pushed north and west into territory no Chinese empire had ever fully controlled. But this was not a traditional Chinese army. This was something new. They built an army designed for mobility, not walls. Heavy armored cavalry, mounted archers, fast-moving infantry, deep logistical planning. Tang generals studied steppe tactics. They copied them. Then they improved them. They recruited Turkic horsemen into Tang service. They promoted generals based on ability, not birth. They rewarded initiative. For the first time, China could fight on equal terms with the nomads who had terrorized it for centuries. In the 630s, Tang armies launched a decisive campaign. They shattered the Eastern Gök Turk Khaganate. Its leaders were captured. Its confederation collapsed. For the first time in history, a Chinese empire had not just defended itself, it had conquered the steppe. Taizong adopted a new title, Heavenly Khagan, a title traditionally reserved for steppe rulers. It was a powerful message. The Tang were no longer just a Chinese dynasty, they were a Eurasian empire. With the steppe secured, the Tang moved west, into what is now modern-day Xinjiang, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. This was not empty land. This was the beating heart of global trade, the Silk Road. Silk was only the beginning. Along these routes flowed gold and silver, spices, glassware, horses, ideas, religions, technologies. Whoever controlled Central Asia controlled the world economy. The Tang did not build colonies. They established protectorates. Local rulers were allowed to remain in power as long as they acknowledged Tang authority and kept the trade routes secure. Garrisons protected the caravan cities. Banditry declined. Trade exploded. For merchants, the Tang period became legendary. It was safer to cross Asia under Tang rule than to travel many roads inside Europe. By the mid-7th century, the Tang Empire stretched across continents, from Korea in the east, Vietnam in the south, Mongolia in the north, and Central Asia in the west. But Tang influence reached even further. Persian merchants traveled to China. Arab diplomats arrived at the capital. Indian monks translated Buddhist texts. Japanese students studied Tang law and administration. The world was flowing into China, and it all led to one city. Chang'an was unlike anything on Earth. A perfectly planned city, wide avenues, massive walls, distinct districts for trade, religion, and government. It housed over 1 million people, at a time when most European cities barely reached 50,000. At night, the city gates closed. Order was enforced. Security was unmatched. Chang'an was not just a capital, it was a statement. This is what power looks like when it is organized. One of the Tang Empire's greatest strengths was that it did not collapse after a great ruler. Successors maintained the system. Military governors were rotated. Bureaucrats were trained through examinations. Taxes flowed. Trade continued. For nearly a century, the Tang Empire stood unchallenged. It had armies that could strike deep into Asia, an economy tied to global trade, a capital that dazzled the world. But at the height of its power, a new force emerged, not from outside, but from within. The Tang had mastered war, they had mastered trade. Now, they would master culture, and in doing so, they would create the greatest golden age China had ever known. At its height, the Tang Dynasty achieved something no empire before it ever had. It became more than a military power, more than a political state. It became a civilizational magnet. People did not just fear Tang China, they wanted to be part of it. Chang'an was not merely large, it was designed. The city followed strict geometric planning. Wide avenues divided districts with mathematical precision. Markets were regulated. Curfews enforced order. But within that order existed extraordinary diversity. In Chang'an, you could hear Chinese, Persian, Sogdian, Turkic, Sanskrit, Arabic. Foreign embassies maintained permanent residences. Merchant guilds controlled entire neighborhoods. Temples, mosques, and shrines stood side by side. This was not multiculturalism by accident, it was policy. The Tang understood something revolutionary: trade flows, where tolerance exists. The Tang economy rested on 3 pillars: agriculture, land reforms distributed farmland to peasants, stabilizing the food supply. Taxation. The state taxed land, labor, and goods efficiently, not excessively. Trade. The Silk Road turned China into the manufacturing engine of Eurasia. Silk, porcelain, paper, tea. These were not luxury items. They were strategic exports. Tang China did not just sell goods, it sold influence. Perhaps the Tang Dynasty's most important innovation had nothing to do with war or trade. It was bureaucracy. The Tang expanded the imperial examination system, selecting officials based on education and merit, rather than noble birth. For the first time in history, talent could outrank lineage. This created a professional ruling class, administrative continuity, institutional memory. Empires before the Tang relied on personalities. The Tang relied on systems. This is why it lasted. Tang China became an intellectual powerhouse. Poetry flourished. Literature reached new heights. Painting, calligraphy, and music evolved rapidly. Poets like Li Bai and Du Fu are still studied today. Religion thrived. Buddhism expanded dramatically. Taoism enjoyed imperial support. Confucianism remained the backbone of the state. The Tang did not enforce uniform belief. they managed belief. Then came a ruler who shattered every expectation, Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. She rose from concubine to empress to sovereign. Her reign divided historians. Some call her ruthless, others call her brilliant. Both are correct. Wu Zetian expanded the examination system. She promoted talented officials, regardless of background. She strengthened central authority, but she also used secret police, purges, propaganda, and yet, under her rule, Tang power did not collapse. It intensified. She understood power as few rulers ever have, and after her death, the empire remained strong. By the early 8th century, Japan modeled its government on Tang law. Korea adopted Tang institutions. Vietnam absorbed Tang administration. Central Asia relied on Tang protection. Tang China was not exporting armies alone. It was exporting civilization. But golden ages carry hidden costs, and beneath the surface of prosperity, pressure was building. Maintaining armies across Asia was expensive. Defending vast trade routes required constant force. Military governors grew powerful. The Tang state began relying on regional commanders, men who controlled their own troops. At first, this seemed efficient. It would prove disastrous, because one of those generals would ignite the greatest catastrophe in Chinese imperial history. The Tang had conquered the steppe. They had mastered trade. They had created a golden age, unmatched in scale. But empires do not fall at their weakest. They fall at their strongest. The greatest danger to the Tang Dynasty did not come from foreign armies. It came from within. By the mid-8th century, Tang China was vast, wealthy, and powerful. But maintaining that power came at a cost. To defend its distant frontiers, the empire relied on regional military governors, men who commanded huge armies far from the capital. They were meant to protect the empire. Instead, one of them tried to take it. His name was An Lushan, a frontier commander of mixed Sogdian and Turkic origin. Charismatic, popular with soldiers, trusted by the court, too trusted. An Lushan controlled massive forces in the northeast. He had access to supply lines, cavalry, veteran troops. In 755, he rebelled. What followed was not a revolt. It was a civil war of annihilation. An Lushan's armies marched south. They captured key cities. They cut supply routes. They pushed toward the heart of the empire. The Tang court panicked. The emperor fled Chang'an. The capital, the center of the world, was abandoned. For the first time in over a century, Tang authority collapsed in full view of the world. The rebellion dragged on for 8 brutal years. Cities were destroyed, farms burned, trade routes collapsed. Modern estimates suggest tens of millions died. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The Tang eventually crushed the rebellion. But victory came at a terrible price. To survive, the empire had to hire foreign mercenaries, give more power to regional warlords, drain the treasury, lose central authority. The Tang Dynasty still existed, but the empire that ruled the world was gone. After An Lushan, Tang China entered a slow unraveling. The court returned to Chang'an, but real power had shifted outward. Military governors became semi-independent. Tax revenues declined. Corruption spread. The bureaucracy still functioned, but without strength behind it. From the outside, Tang China still looked intact. The emperor still ruled. The capital still stood. Ceremonies continued, but underneath, the system was hollow. Eunuchs dominated court politics. Factions paralyzed decision-making. Rebellions flared constantly. The empire was no longer leading the world. It was struggling to survive. In 907, After decades of chaos, the last Tang emperor was deposed. China fractured once again into rival kingdoms. The Tang Dynasty ended. But something extraordinary happened. The world did not forget it. The Tang Dynasty collapsed as a state, but it endured as a model. Its systems shaped later Chinese dynasties, Japanese government, Korean administration, and Vietnamese law. Its culture defined poetry, art, philosophy, urban planning. Its capital, Chang'an, became the blueprint for cities across East Asia. And its greatest achievement was not territory. It was integration. The Tang proved that power did not come only from conquest. It came from administration, tolerance, infrastructure, education, trade. Where Rome ruled roads, the Tang ruled networks. Where others ruled land, the Tang ruled connections. Some empires ruled continents, some ruled centuries. The Tang ruled the world system, and long before Europe woke up, the world already had a center.